And let me just give as one example. In Sunday's magazine section, there was an article on Ben Rhodes, and it talks, basically, he describes how he manufactured, and uses that word, manufactures, for example, the notion that the Iran treaty would strengthen the moderates against the mullahs in Iran, and that this was totally manufactured because his job was to sell the treaty. And at the same time that the New York Times puts this out, they are still continuing to act on that discredited concept, and I will believe will continue to do that despite this.
The Ben Rhodes story is going to make a great book soon. Maybe Paul, you'll write it. It is, we had a similar view of this from the other side 15 years ago when the George W. Bush administration tried to manufacture support for the Iraq War, right? So you have, I think this book on Ben Rhodes would be the opposite side and would be fascinating to write. It is an important story. And the Times schizophrenia around the Iran nuclear deal is exceptional to watch. I want to keep your question in mind, Paul, or your point, which I think is a good one, and just read what she writes on page 8, because I think it's helpful and it maybe will help us think this through. So she's talking about the rise of the PR men and their importance. And then she says, and by the way, she in the end says that the real problem was not the PR men, it was the problem solvers. So we have to understand that. But she says the only limitation to what the public relations man does, the only limitation to what he does comes when he discovers that the same people who perhaps can be manipulated to buy a certain kind of soap cannot be manipulated, though of course they can be forced by terror to, quote, buy opinions and political views. Therefore, the psychological premise of human manipulability has become one of the chief wares that are sold on the market of common and learned opinion. But such doctrines do not change the way people form opinions or prevent them from acting according to their own lights. The only method short of terror to have real influence on their conduct is still the old carrot and stick approach. It is not surprising that the recent generation of intellectuals who grew up in the insane atmosphere of rampant advertising and were taught that half of politics is image making and the other half the art of making people believe in the imagery should almost automatically fall back on the older adages of carrot and stick whenever the situation becomes too serious for theory. So I read that because I think Paul and Jack and others are raising an important question, which is that on the one hand, it does seem that politics is manipulable, right? That we in the I think it was the Frank Rich book was called The Greatest War Ever Sold, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea, there was that famous quote by someone in the Bush administration that we had to wait till after Labor Day to sell the war because no one starts an advertising campaign before Labor Day. And the idea that the war was going to be sold and manipulated. And clearly, Ben Rhodes was someone who worked very hard to manipulate the sale of the Iran nuclear treaty. So this suggests that maybe Arendt's wrong, that we PR people can manipulate public opinion. And yet there are, I don't know the poll numbers, Paul, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I would say large numbers of American people don't agree with Paul Rhodes and don't agree that the nuclear treaty was the right treaty. It's interesting. The people it most successfully succeeded in manipulating were whom? The intellectuals, the social scientists, the people,
and the liberals in general.
Well, okay, but we have to somewhat separate that out because many liberals in general were of the opinion to support the treaty, whether or not it actually would support the Iranian moderates or not. We have to understand that a large number of the people who supported the treaty were going to support it regardless of this data and this information. So the question then becomes, how many people who weren't going to support it were manipulated to support it because of this? You understand my point, Paul?
Yeah, I do. You also have to wonder how many people, once again, let's talk about democracy. So we're talking about a wider circle of people. How many people who would basically be really unable to come to an informed opinion find themselves being swayed by the avalanche? I mean, I read the New York Times. I listen to NPR. And it's amazing to watch a story pop up on one of these outlets and then the next day see it circulated with the exact same line, with the exact same spin throughout the media. And it's an avalanche, and the average person is not in a position to stand his ground and say, I've got different information.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit. I mean, who reads the New York Times and listens to NPR? Are they the same people who watch Fox News and read Instapundit and PJ Media? The point is that on both sides, right, the majority of people listen to the news organizations they listen to, not because they want facts so that they can make up their opinion, but because they want to hear their opinion made in as clear a way as possible.
So maybe we're talking then about questions of human nature. People want to be deceived in a certain sense. People want to be told that their group is the best group and the other group is the worst group. I find an amazing parallelism between the supporters of Donald Trump and the viewers of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And it's no accident that Trump himself, I mean, there's footage on YouTube of Trump getting a body slam in WrestleMania. But the notion, the wrestling interviews, I don't know if you recall, there used to be a character called the Iron Sheik, and he was opposed to another character named Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And Hacksaw Jim Duggan would come on with a 2x4 with an American flag stuck into the end of it. And the Iron Sheik would come out with a flag with a picture of the Ayatollah Khomeini and his curved Persian boots. And the Iron Sheik would beat the living daylights out of Hacksaw Jim Duggan until the audience started chanting, USA, USA, at which point, like Popeye eating the spinach, Hacksaw Jim Duggan would get up and win the match. And I think that this, you see this in the guts of the faces of the people in Trump rallies.
Okay. So you know much more about pro wrestling than I will ever want to know, and I am so glad that you brought the Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the other guy, Ayatollah and Iron Sheik in. This is beautiful. Let me simply say, I don't want to create a negative, hostile view of humanity, but I do think that many people have strong opinions. And I think that it's a rarity when people's opinions are changed by the media. That doesn't mean it never happens.